So I'd just like to say a little bit of housekeeping about using this system on GoToWebinar. There will be a place where you can ask questions during the presentation. And if so, you can type it into the question box or into the chat function, which is at the very bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel. So if you do have questions, let us know. You are all automatically muted, and you should be able to hear William and myself. When William starts giving his presentation, I'll go ahead and mute myself too. But I will be monitoring that chat and question function if you should have any questions. But welcome. We're so glad you're here today. And I will let Mr. Henry go forward with his presentation. We'll have a few announcements at the end. So now I'm going to give you the screen, and you should see it come through.
Okay, well, hello everybody. I'm William Henry, as Gretchen said, and my organization, Volunteers Insurance Service, provides insurance and risk management services to protect the volunteers of nonprofits and also public entities that engage volunteers nationwide. I'm glad to have the opportunity to be with you today to discuss the risks that go along with volunteer engagement and what you can do to deal with those risks. Over the 40-plus years that our volunteer insurance program has existed, we've seen certain kinds of claims repeatedly, as well as a few
William?
left. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't see your screen yet. Did you tell it to show your screen?
Let's see. How's that?
Yes, we've got it. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Back with you. So today we're going to look at how these kinds of claims involving volunteers occur and what we can do to prevent them. At the end of the webinar, you'll know how to identify risks that are specific to you, how to minimize them, and then when something bad happens despite your best efforts, how you can deal with it. Just as important, you'll know how to keep the risk management effort going strong, even as your staff and your volunteers come and go. So I'd like to, Gretchen, are you ready with the instant poll? The questions to help
Yes,
people
I am.
Evaluate where they are presently. All right, good.
Yes.
I want to ask you a few questions about what you already do to manage your volunteer risks. So please answer yes or no to each of the questions that you will see on your screen. The first one, have you analyzed tasks volunteers perform from the standpoint of safety for volunteers and for others around them? Don't spend too much time.
I'm sorry, I'm going to give folks just about 30 seconds to vote, but we've almost got total participation, so that's good.
All right, so they can see the questions. Good. That's the main thing, because, you know, you have to ask the question, what could possibly go wrong, and I don't want people not to see the questions. So, yeah, don't spend too much time thinking about it, just a quick yes or no. And tell me when I should go to the second question.
Go ahead.
Or let's see the results of the first one.
Do you see them? It says 88% yes and 13% no. So most everybody does.
All right, great. The second question, do you interview volunteers to learn what skills they do or do not have and assign work accordingly?
Okay, we've got that one is done. The results are 75% yes and 25% no.
Boy, I'm with a great group today.
Yay.
All right, the third question, do you inspect the locations where volunteers are assigned for potential hazards such as falls, fire, poor lighting, any hazards like that?
Okay, and here's our results. We've got, again, 75% yes, 25% no.
Great. All right. Next question, do you train volunteers to ensure that they can perform their tasks skillfully and safely?
Oh, wait a minute. I may have the wrong poll here. Just bear with me for a moment. Sorry. There we go.
That's okay. The questions are not in any particular order.
All right. 100% yes.
Amazing. Well, actually, with Alive members, I'm not too amazed because you are the best of the best. Okay, ready for the next question?
You bet.
Are supervisors assigned to volunteers, and are they held accountable for making sure that volunteers perform their assignments as they've been trained?
And I think this one I had pulled up accidentally, and someone we'd had a little bit of voting. We had 100% yes on this, though, with the voting that we'd had in so far.
On the accountability question?
That's right. So we can go to the last one.
Terrific. Do you have a specific action plan in the event a volunteer is injured, injures someone, or damages someone's property? An action plan.
Okay, and the results of that are 78% yes and 22% no.
All right, great. Well, for those who aren't 100% on all the questions or weren't sure about some, I think I can help you today. By the way, the questions that I just used are from a more detailed questionnaire that's included in your handouts. All right, now I'm trying to advance my slide.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up the quick handout, but you will be getting this automatically as part of your follow-up for this webinar today. So I will go back to the presentation. Okay.
All right. These are the 4 categories of claims that we see in our volunteer insurance program. If you see that slide called Most Common Risks. Today, as we go through the rest of the session, I want you to think about what your volunteers do and write down all the scenarios you can think of where a volunteer could be injured, injure someone else, damage someone's property, or commit a dishonest act that hurts the organization. In a phrase, what could possibly go wrong? Now, I'm sure that most of you are positive people most of the time, but sometimes you have to think negatively in order to keep negative things from happening. So we'll do some negative thinking today. I'll get it going by giving you some examples of actual claims we have seen in our program, starting with injuries to the volunteer. Falling is the most common type of accident that causes injury claims with volunteers. To prevent falls, you have to look at the environment that the volunteer will be assigned to, whether it's a location you see every day or maybe another location where the volunteer is assigned. If it's possible for the supervisor to scout those locations where volunteers will be assigned, that's the best way. But if it isn't possible, in your volunteer orientation and training, tell them you want them to be your eyes and ears at the locations where they're working and report any conditions that might cause an injury to them or anyone else. And designate a person to whom the volunteer can report, someone who will make sure that those hazards are eliminated, either doing the work themselves or maybe assigning it to a veteran volunteer who's capable. All right, what kinds of hazards are we looking for that might cause a fall? Is there any clutter on the floor? Boxes left out where people walk? Loose rugs, extension cords, poor lighting on stairways, loose handrails? We've had claims caused by all those kinds of falls. As you think about the task your volunteers do they ever have to reach anything up high, even occasionally? Make sure that there are ladders or step stools that are easily available. If the volunteer is working at a remote location where there's no ladder or stool provided, maybe in a client's home, have the volunteer bring one from their home. They can just leave it in their vehicle until it's needed. Do volunteers or anyone else have to carry things up or down stairs? One hand should be free to use the handrail. Don't carry anything heavy enough to require both hands. That's definitely inviting a fall. We've seen too many of those. So what do? Take 2 trips with smaller loads instead. Here's an animating truth for your risk management program. You might be familiar with the territory, but the new volunteer is not. So make sure volunteers are mentally prepared for anything that's different from what they're accustomed to. Maybe you've heard of the Foster Grandparent Program. It's part of the Corporation for National and Community Services Senior Corps. We insure all the foster grandparents. We see a lot of injuries that could have been prevented if the supervisor had devoted just a little time to training. A new foster grandparent volunteer who's accustomed to living in a quiet environment at home might not be ready for a classroom where little kids can dart out in front of you, stick their feet out, and trip you, tug on your sleeve, even jump on your back. We've had a couple of claims caused by that. Now, you might not even have volunteers who work around little kids, but I'll bet you have volunteers working where they could trip over something that they didn't see. Maybe you're imagining some ways that they might fall as you think about the assignments they have. And you might be surprised how expensive those common injuries can be. By the time you add up the ambulance bill, the doctor and hospital charges, prescription drugs, physical therapy, and all the rest, you get into several $1,000s pretty quickly. Winter adds to the risk of injuries due to falls. Are your volunteers prepared to clear the walk and the steps at the locations where they're working? All right, let's look at other kinds of injuries besides falls. Do your volunteers have to move things, especially heavy things? One volunteer was hauling furniture in a pickup truck once. The truck was full, the load wasn't balanced well, and when he tried to take the first piece out of the truck, the whole load shifted and knocked him out of the truck. He broke his leg. So think about how you could prevent something like that. You could make more trips instead of overloading the truck. If a bigger truck is available, that's an option. Maybe some training in the use of ropes to secure that furniture. In risk management, always look for the simplest, most practical solution first. Usually it's the right one. There's really no magic in risk management. There's some assembly required, but no magic involved. All right, so when volunteers have to lift things and carry things, what's the big risk? If you're thinking back injury, you're right. So make sure volunteers know how to lift properly. You lift with the legs, not the back. You know the drill. And maybe the loads they're carrying should be smaller too. Maybe hand trucks, dollies, other materials handling equipment are needed. I have a resource for you. We've developed some 1-page and 2-page documents on a variety of safety subjects, including safe lifting. The index to our preventer papers is in the handouts for this session. And if you call me or email me with the titles of any papers that you'd like to have, I will email those right back to you. All right, let's look at some other common kinds of injury claims. If your volunteers use tools in their work, have them show you that they know how to use those tools, not just tell you that they do. One volunteer was trying to pull a nail from a board for the very first time. Instead of prying it out with her claw hammer, she tried to pull it straight out of the board, straight towards her face. So, what do you suppose happened there? She hit herself in the mouth, and it was wrong for her supervisor to assume that she knew how to pull a nail. It might seem like common knowledge, but You can't take anything for granted with a volunteer's preparation. So 1 minute of training could have prevented that accident and all that dental work. So think about all the things your volunteers have to do. Designate one or more volunteers who already know how to do those things safely to be your instructors for safety training purposes. Make it their responsibility to have new volunteers demonstrate that they can use the tools they need safely and provide whatever training is necessary before the work begins. You know, having veteran volunteers train new ones is good for both. We see some claims also resulting from injuries while volunteers are working outdoors. You might have volunteers doing outdoor home repairs, landscaping, for example. And many times, those kinds of accidents can be prevented by just requiring volunteers to wear long sleeves, gloves, safety glasses, the right kind of shoes, especially those gloves. Anytime your volunteers use cutting tools or handle sharp materials, it's a good idea to require that they wear leather gloves. You don't have to provide them. Just tell the volunteer they'll need them. They'll bring their own. We also see some claims for allergic reactions to bee stings, poison ivy, and pollen. Protective clothing can help, and maybe a mask for that pollen, but maybe a volunteer who has allergies should be assigned something to do indoors, or to provide transportation services if that's part of what you do, at least at certain times of the year. You know, it's okay to ask about allergies and any other medical condition or physical limitation that could affect a volunteer's ability to carry out a task safely. They'll appreciate the concern, and you can prevent some problems. Any questions that have come in so far, Gretchen, about falls or safe lifting, outdoor work, use of tools?
I don't see any yet. Let me just double check. But this is probably a great time. If someone does have a question, you can use the question format, or you can type it into the chat box.
All right. And while they're doing that, if there are any questions, I'll move on and we'll go back and pick those questions up in a few minutes.
Sounds good.
Take time to watch your volunteers in action and correct them if they're doing something that's unsafe. Just let them know you want everyone to work safely so no one gets hurt. If you say it with an attitude of helpfulness, they're likely to appreciate that message and be more aware of hazards. Safety training is like any other training. You have to express yourself in the best way for the information to be accepted. People sometimes forget what you say, but they always remember how you made them feel when you said it. If you can make time for it, you can have safety sessions with volunteers as a group and educate everyone at once. In the construction trade, they call these toolbox talks. Take 5 minutes on one specific topic. If you do that regularly, volunteers will become more safety conscious. And as I mentioned, these preventer papers are available to you. They're good for small group training, but if that's not possible for you, you can just give the papers to your volunteers individually. All right, let's move away from injuries and talk about liability, the L word. Every time I go to a nonprofit conference, I hear this word a lot. What's our liability if we do this? You know, it would serve our mission, but what about the liability? Someone would like to volunteer, but if they're working directly with clients, especially, they're worried about liability. Fear of the unknown is understandable. Now, I get that. But the good news is that liability usually can be managed. You can put that L word in its place. So let's look at it. What does liability mean? It's a situation in which the volunteer and/or your organization is held responsible for bodily injury or property damage. There are other kinds of liability too, but for this session, we'll stick to bodily injury and property damage. If there's a lawsuit, it will say that your volunteer was negligent or your organization itself was negligent. And here's a working definition of negligence. You might want to write this down. It means you did not do something that you should have known to do, or you did something you should have known not to do. If you did not properly screen, train, or supervise the volunteer who's involved, that is how liability might extend to your organization. And we'll talk a little bit about training and supervising a little later. Of course, I know from your poll questions that you put a lot of emphasis on training already. Now, if there's a charge of negligence, it might not even be valid. People are sued all the time for things that they didn't do. But it's important to create an environment where the chances of a liability claim are as low as you can make them. Sometimes claims in our insurance program arise out of situations involving vulnerable people, children, the elderly, or those with chronic illness or disabilities. I'm sure some of you serve those kinds of clients. It's good risk management to perform criminal background checks on any volunteer who would be working with vulnerable clients. I know you probably do that. Verified Volunteers is one good provider of screening services. They're an official partner of ours. Background checks are good, but they're not enough. You might have a volunteer who's never been arrested or investigated for anything, but still might injure a client. There might be a verbal assault if the volunteer loses his or her temper, or it could even be a physical assault. It doesn't happen often, but we have had claims in which volunteers lost their temper and struck people in their care. So you have to have rules on what volunteers can and cannot do, and then communicate those rules and enforce them. I hear a lot about empowering volunteers to decide for themselves how to carry out their assignments. That doesn't work in risk management. It just doesn't. If volunteers don't have instructions from you, they might react to situations the same way they would with their own family members. And their way might be okay or it might not, but don't leave them to their own devices. Just scrub that word empowerment from your risk management vocabulary. So, for example, we suggest that you have written procedures for how volunteers should defuse a situation where the person in their care becomes agitated or even verbally abusive to a volunteer. It might not happen often, but it's best to have that volunteer mentally prepared for any situation where tension might be high and emotions could take over their actions. Just like you want them mentally prepared for hazards that could cause an injury to the volunteers, you also want them mentally prepared for situations that could escalate into their hurting someone else, or at least being accused of hurting someone. And here's another type of liability claim we had. An elderly man was injured when he fell out of his wheelchair that was being pushed by a volunteer. He was afraid the chair was going too fast, so he put his feet out to stop it, and he was thrown out. Now, if any of us had seen it, we probably would have agreed that the chair actually was traveling at a safe speed, but the man in the chair didn't think so, and that's all that matters. So, ask if the speed is okay. Take time to listen to the answer. Elderly people who are fragile can be very fearful of injury, as you might have learned. I can't see you, but I can almost see some of you nodding your heads. So good communication can help avoid an incident that could result in a liability claim. So make sure your safety training includes how to communicate effectively with clients if you have volunteers who have client-facing responsibilities. Bodily injury also includes sexual abuse and molestation. And it has to be a concern to any organization that works with vulnerable populations. As I said before, sometimes accusations are false. But even if you're blameless, you still have to defend yourself. And that can be very expensive, both financially and in terms of your reputation and the distraction that the incident causes. Insurance comes into play, but do what you can to reduce the risk that an incident will occur or a volunteer is in a position where he or she could be falsely accused. Require background checks, certainly, for any volunteers working with vulnerable individuals. Have written procedures and take time to explain them. Having procedures designed to prevent bodily harm will help you in two important ways. First, you can make sure your volunteers are consistent in how they deal with those that they're caring for. And two, you'll discourage any people who might have bad intent and want to volunteer for your organization. The more obstacles you can put in front of those people, the more likely they'll just walk away and leave you alone. In the last part of the session, we'll get into just how you decide the procedures that are right for you. There's a method that works, and anyone can apply it. But let's take a moment here to see if there are questions about liability, bodily injury, property damage. All right.
William, this is Gretchen.
Yeah.
Just anecdotally, what kind of trends have you seen in the past 5 years in terms of liability issues?
You know, the main thing is not really an increase in liability claims. The main thing that we've seen is an increase in volunteers and potential volunteers' awareness and fear of liability. And it's the litigious society we live in. So I've heard from many of our members that it's becomes a recruitment issue. And it's hard to get people who are willing to come forward in the absence of any assurance that you have addressed the liability issue. That's really the main thing we've seen, not so much an increase in actual claims.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
All right. We'll talk about auto liability here, the third bullet on the screen. I'm sure some of you have volunteers who drive as part of their assignments, driving their own vehicles to transport clients for medical appointments or to go shopping or other places they need to go, or maybe they use their vehicles to take supplies back and forth to support your operations, meals delivery, or whatever else it might be that requires that transportation. From the claims that we see in our program, accidents at intersections are the most common kind, especially left turns when the volunteer doesn't have the right of way, or turning from the wrong lane, running stop signs, those kinds of things at intersections. If there's poor visibility because of inclement weather, that just amplifies the risk. Sometimes accidents are very serious. A volunteer insured in our program turned left in front of an oncoming vehicle. She was killed, and the two occupants of the other vehicle were seriously injured. And there have been other very serious accidents in which volunteers were at fault. So what to do? Getting motor vehicle records is a very good idea to make sure that your volunteers haven't had serious violations. The same as with background checks, getting motor vehicle records can help if your organization is sued for something that the volunteer did. Why? Because it demonstrates that you did your due diligence, and that can help protect you against a charge of negligence. And when you protect yourself against charges of negligence, it reduces the what? That L word. One of the handouts for this webinar is a motor vehicle acceptability checklist that we created to help you evaluate someone's motor vehicle record objectively. If your state requires annual vehicle inspections, put each volunteer's vehicle inspection date on your calendar and ask them for a copy of the certificate every year. Vehicle-related accidents don't always occur in traffic, by the way. We had a claim resulting from a fatality in a parking lot. The volunteer did not realize that the client was behind her car and backed over her. How could that have been prevented? Well, if there had been a rule that the volunteer could not leave the parking spot until the client was safely buckled in, the client might be alive today. In another claim, a client tried to get into the volunteer's car while the car was in gear. The volunteer's foot slipped off the brake pedal, and the client fell and broke her leg. So think about how that might have been prevented. If the volunteer had been trained to keep her doors locked unless the car was in park, the client would not have been able to open the door and try to get in. See what I mean about there being no magic in risk management? Common sense, the most simple solution. That's the path to follow. You might consider having a written test on your safety requirements for motor vehicle use that volunteers need to pass before they can transport anyone for you. Having the test tends to focus the attention. So, as with many of the risks we're talking about today, awareness and communication are the keys to risk management. By the way, those preventer papers that I mentioned include 24 papers on vehicle safety. The last of the 4 most common risks I want to mention today is dishonesty. What access do volunteers, or your staff for that matter, have to bank information and other sensitive data that might present an opportunity for embezzling funds? It happens sometimes. It happened recently to a major state association of volunteer managers. Almost always it's a big surprise. The thief is someone who was trusted. We won't go into that risk area in detail today, but one of my handouts has suggestions on preventing this kind of loss. There's also insurance available to protect your organization in that area. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is to show how to develop a system to prevent all these bad things from happening. But are there any questions, Gretchen, before we go there?
I'm just looking, and it doesn't look like it.
Okay,
I think
so
we're okay.
Everyone either knows all this stuff, or they're stunned, or they're just continuing to think negatively. So, but we'll have time as we move along for any questions that do come up. All right, so we've talked about a lot of different risk scenarios and how those risks can be addressed. And now let's put it all together into a system that allows you to identify risks specific to your particular operation and manage those risks in a way that's going to work today, next month, or next year, no matter who comes and goes in the organization. The goal is to create an environment, or you might say a culture, of risk awareness. This slide shows the basic steps. We've done a little risk identification today as we reviewed various injury and liability scenarios, and that's the first step. What comes next is deciding what risks you should worry about the most and which ones you can accept. Then determine how you can reduce or eliminate the most serious risks. Insurance is for the serious risks that you cannot eliminate entirely. So next, decide how you will respond if an incident does occur. Make risk management a guiding principle of your selection, orientation, and training. Hold people accountable for following your procedures, and if something bad does happen, learn what you can from it so it doesn't happen again. So let's break all this down, looking first at the innards of risk identification. After you've thought of the fall hazards, the back injuries from heavy lifting, working with vulnerable clients, and some of the other risks we've identified today, dig deeper. Get your best people together and think about what could possibly happen. Your best people might include someone from another organization who's already been through the process you're starting, maybe another member of Alive. Your best people might include someone in a discussion group on LinkedIn. What could possibly go wrong? Utilities and mass transit systems have been exploring that question for many years. After Hurricane Sandy in 2012, new chapters were added to those plans. And after the ice storm in January of 2014 that gridlocked Atlanta, state and local officials added new chapters to their own disaster plans. I believe one chapter's title is "Not Good for Everyone to Try to Go Home at One Time." And in Boston 6 years ago, the police department, fire department, emergency medical teams, and hospitals conducted drills on how to respond if there were multiple bomb attacks in the city. So, on the day of the Boston Marathon in April 2013, many lives were saved because those people knew exactly what to do when the unthinkable happened. At the state prison in Dannemora, New York, they had to revisit their risk management practices a couple of years ago, especially that part about securing their power tools so that employees can't get them and give them to prisoners with whom they were romantically involved, who then could cut holes in steam pipes and escape the prison. You have to dig deep to come up with a risk scenario like that, but there it was. And we know way too many cases of people who have been shot and killed by law enforcement officers, even though, as we learned after the fact, they did not really present a threat. That's pretty unthinkable stuff, but every organization has unthinkables, including yours. And that's why that threshold question, what could possibly go wrong, is so important. To find answers, you do have to dig deep. We talked about screening volunteers and training them to prevent a possible assault on someone in their care. But look at it from the other side, too, in your deep dive. What if a volunteer were assaulted by a client, or by a client's dog, or a client's nephew? Would these kinds of scenarios be possible in your world? What if a volunteer in your office accidentally clicked on a ransomware link? What if a volunteer lost or stole your membership list or your donor list? If you have volunteers working with clients in the client's home, are they ever asked to do anything unexpected? Maybe, hey, can you help me move this heavy piece of furniture from the attic to the basement? Or just something as simple as reaching an item on a high shelf inside the house. There could be a risk exposure there. The risk that the volunteer might fall, might suffer a back injury, as we talked about early in this session. Or it could be a situation where a client who is mentally unstable accuses the volunteer of assaulting her or him, or stealing something from the home. So what if a volunteer unintentionally violated IRS rules regarding political activity by nonprofits and jeopardized your tax-exempt status? It's easy to make that mistake. If you make statements on behalf of your organization that favor a particular political candidate. If you need more information about that, irs.gov in the section on nonprofits has a lot of detail. In brainstorming your scenarios, don't stop until you have at least 25. Then assign each of those risks a grade of A, B, C, or D for the severity of the risk. The screaming disasters that would threaten your organization's existence would have a grade of A, and those you could get past with just minor inconvenience would be D. So just take a few seconds now to think of what a grade A disaster for your organization would be and write it down. Whatever you wrote down, would it be uncomfortable to discuss as you develop your risk management program? Maybe something involving elder abuse or some other criminal activity. If so, and you're still willing to discuss it, you're on the right track. There can't be any taboos in risk management. If it can't be discussed, it can't be managed. So first, assess the severity of all the risk you can imagine, and then assess the frequency of each risk, again using that A, B, C, and D system. But the highest frequency doesn't necessarily mean the most serious risk. If your volunteers do home repair projects or other light construction, or maybe they're clearing brush for a conservation project, something like that, they might get a mashed finger every now and then. It really comes with the territory. So that's a frequency of A, but usually the injury isn't severe, so it's not a risk that you should worry about that much. On the other hand, there could be a very remote risk scenario that's so severe You want to reduce or eliminate it as a top priority. If you might remember the Second Mile Foundation in State College, Pennsylvania, was destroyed because there was too much looking the other way with the activities of Jerry Sandusky, the founder, or the Florida Grand Floridian Resort in Florida, where the alligator attacked the small boy. So you have to consider severity and frequency together as you evaluate how serious each risk is. All right, once you've identified your risk, go to the next step here. What can you do to eliminate or reduce them? Here's an example of how to do that. I mentioned the scenario of a volunteer who's at a client's home and is asked to perform some unexpected task, such as moving a heavy piece of furniture. The volunteer could suffer a back injury, or might fall, or might be accused of assaulting the client. As you think about how to eliminate or reduce the risks of what might happen in someone's home, you might come up with an approach like this. It's a basic approach to risk management, and these principles apply to whatever your volunteers do. Now, for this to work, there needs to be a chain of command, some sort of supervisory structure for your volunteers, whether it's a staff person, a veteran volunteer, or a board member. So as I go through this, imagine yourself as the supervisor. First, determine whether volunteers will be allowed to do anything other than their primary responsibilities they've been trained to do. If you decide, yes, we're open to requests that the client might make, your procedure might be to have volunteers call you first before doing whatever it is they've been asked to do. If the volunteer can't reach you, he or she should put the request on hold until you can discuss it with the volunteer and with the person they're helping, so that everyone understands exactly what the request is. And then if you say it's okay for the volunteer to do the work that's been requested, have the volunteer call you once that task is done, even if it's just to leave a voice message saying the job is finished and the volunteer is leaving. And one more thing, tell the volunteer to have the client speak on that message too, to confirm that the task has been done. You'll know that your volunteer is okay and the person they're helping is satisfied. Now, that might seem like way too much communication over moving a desk or carrying some bags of mulch to the flower beds for the client, but consider the possibility I just mentioned, that a volunteer would be falsely accused of assaulting someone. If you have a voice message with both the volunteer and the client confirming that the task has been done, the volunteer is leaving, that can certainly help the volunteer's defense if he or she is falsely accused. Do you see how these procedures could help manage your risk that a volunteer will be injured or held liable for injuring someone if they're working in someone's home? You can use a similar approach, as I said, to apply risk management to virtually every scenario you can imagine when you entertain that threshold question, what could possibly go wrong? You're taking time to evaluate the risk, if there is one, and making sure that communication is clear. The task is done, the volunteer is safe, the client is satisfied. Now, keep in mind that another volunteer-based organization might be better suited for certain activities, and you might find that you can coordinate services with them. If you work with elderly clients, for example, you might coordinate with your local area agency on aging. I'm sure some of you already do. The system that you develop to manage your risk also might include training on those IRS rules about political advocacy. It could include training in vehicle safety, separation of duties where handling the organization's money is involved, awareness of online scams, eliminating hazards that could cause a fall, or a number of other strategies that address what your volunteers do. The key is to think through what your volunteers will be doing, think about what could go wrong, and figure out a practical way to prevent those outcomes. And my association has a variety of resources to help you in this area, so call me anytime you'd like to discuss your particular needs. If I have a resource that's appropriate, I'm happy to share it with you. Also, every one of your organizations is buying a general liability insurance policy, I'm sure. And every insurance company has a loss control department. So you're paying them. So put those people to work for you. You see a reference in the second bullet there on the screen to risk transfer. That means you buy insurance for the serious risks that can't be eliminated entirely. Our organization specializes in insurance that protects the organization and volunteers in case, despite your best efforts, volunteers do get injured, or they accidentally injure someone else, or damage someone's property, or they're at fault in a vehicle accident. That's how I know about all these claim scenarios that I described. One of the handouts for this session is an overview of the kinds of insurance that nonprofit organizations typically need. Okay, let's have a look at selection, orientation, and training. I already know from the poll questions that many of you have outstanding programs for that. It's an important element of risk management. Does everyone use a registration form? Make that work for you to your advantage. Use it to describe your available assignments, ask about their areas of interest, special skills, but also ask about allergies or other medical conditions that might affect the assignments that you'll make. The selection process also includes background checks if the volunteer is working with vulnerable clients or handling money. Be careful with that, though. The Federal Trade Commission has ruled that the Fair Credit Reporting Act applies to volunteers as well as employees. So, if you pull a credit history on a volunteer, you have to have a reason to do it, a reason that's related to what that volunteer's responsibilities will be. You can't just do it for all volunteers, regardless of their duties. There are a variety of federal and state laws that apply, and that's why it's best to rely on a professional firm, I mentioned Verified Volunteers, to do that work for you. Check motor vehicle records once a year if the volunteer will be driving on behalf of the organization. Track those state inspections for the vehicle. Orientation is so important. One of the risks with volunteer involvement is not communicating what's expected, and your orientation is a good opportunity to reduce that risk. When people are left to improvise, the results might not be very good, so take improvisation off the table. Does the volunteer know who to report to? Who do they see if they need something or have a complaint or a problem? Take time to explain safety rules that go with the volunteer assignment. Record-keeping requirements, timesheets, reimbursement forms, those kinds of things. When you take time to do it right, it shows the volunteer you're sailing a tight ship. I mentioned the value of having veteran volunteers train new ones. That's a good way to reinforce the veteran volunteer's own knowledge as well as to train the new person. And it's one more way of reminding the volunteer, the veteran, that you value their skill and experience. Correct poor performance and discipline volunteers as needed. Just because they're unpaid, that doesn't mean you can't discipline them and even terminate them if necessary. Sometimes in a close-knit organization, people are reluctant to question or criticize others, but that reluctance creates a risk, and it can hurt you, just as it hurt the Second Mile Foundation in State College, Pennsylvania. Founder syndrome destroyed that organization. Don't worry about offending the volunteer. As long as you're sincere with them and keep your organization's interests as your first priority, you'll be fine. Also, if you adopt new performance standards, make sure your current volunteers know that the new standards are not some backdoor criticism of their performance. Just let them know you're adopting some standard procedures as part of your program to manage risks. And now to the last item here. What if something happens despite your best efforts to prevent it? Have formal procedures for responding to an incident. If a volunteer is injured, injures someone, or damages someone's property, what are their responsibilities and those of their supervisor? Make sure it's written, communicated, and understood. Make sure volunteers know if there's an injury or a potential liability situation, they're to report it to their supervisor. Police, not to a local government agency, but to the supervisor. as long as that arrangement complies with the mandated reporting laws where you are, and make it the supervisor's job to handle it from there. How does the supervisor know what to do? It goes back to brainstorming those risk scenarios and how to deal with them. Develop the appropriate response for each risk scenario that you identify. In the case of an injury, once the injured person gets medical attention, get as much information as you can about what caused the injury. Talk to witnesses, write down what they say, get their contact information. If there's a dispute over the facts, get both sides. And if you have a situation where a liability claim might arise, don't admit liability, just get the facts. Tell the other party you'll report the incident to your insurance company. And report it right away. Claims, especially liability claims, are often slow to develop. When they're made, you can trace them back to one or two incidents that happened months earlier. So it's important to begin your investigation at the first hint of a problem and put your insurance company on notice. Don't let your attorney decide whether to report the claim. Don't wait to see if it will all blow over. That could jeopardize your coverage. The insurance contract says you have to provide timely notification, and you don't want to be arguing about whether your claim was timely. And after your initial response, see what you can learn from it. Deconstruct what happened. Were your safety procedures being followed? If not, why not? What should have been done differently? Having that information can help with training to prevent a future occurrence. So, that is an overview of managing the risks that go with volunteer engagement. This slide shows the handouts that you can download for today's session. If you decide to develop a formal risk management system or refine the one you have, you might want to make it official by adopting a risk management policy statement. There's a sample in the handouts. Communicate your risk management policy throughout the organization. Every year you have to file that Form 990. Mention it there and in other documents that your supporters might see. All right, we have a few minutes left. Are there questions now? I can't believe nobody's asked me about the volunteer waiver.
Okay, I'll buy it.
Every time I do a workshop, people say, well, we have our volunteers sign a waiver. Don't depend on that. They've been struck down many times in court as being construed in too much in favor of the organization. If your waiver says we're not responsible if anything bad happens to you, or any broad language like that, it's not likely to protect you very much if a volunteer gets hurt and decides to sue you. So the main value of a waiver is just it tends to focus the volunteer's attention on the fact that there are risks that they might not be aware of, but that's about the limit to which you should rely on it.
All right, thank you very much. I'm just looking at the chat box and the question, and I don't see any questions. We've just got a few more minutes left for our webinar today. While you're thinking of any additional questions, let me see if there's anything that I would like to ask. So when you talk about those waivers, would you recommend that none be done at all? Because do you feel they really don't serve any purpose?
If I were building an organization from the ground up, I don't think I would have a waiver. But if you already have one, or if there's someone on your board of directors, maybe the lawyer who's on your board says, oh, we need a waiver, there's nothing wrong with it in and of itself, unless you just depend on it totally.
I see. Okay. And I think my other question is just about the allergies question. And is that just as simple as, do you have any allergies we should be aware of? Or do you think it would be better for the organization to spell that out? Like in working with a client, you might be exposed to, animals or some type of chemical. Or do you have allergies to this issue, or do you want to leave that as open-ended as possible?
I would leave it open-ended. And if you have descriptions of the volunteer assignments that are available, the new volunteer or the prospective volunteer can look at that and say, okay, I would be affected or I would not be affected by that exposure.
Okay.
But sometimes people think that they're not allowed to ask questions about medical conditions. That's not true.
Right. And I think that's something that would have been helpful in some past volunteer roles that I've managed. And I did not realize I could do that. And okay, well, I'm looking. I don't see any other questions. We'll go ahead and follow up. You'll get a follow-up email. We'll send information about the handouts and any other feedback you have for us. We would love to hear it. And I'd like to thank William very much for his time and expertise today. And we're excited to be a partner with Volunteers Insurance Service Association. And we are also a partner with Verified Volunteers that Mr. Henry referenced several times. And we'd like to thank Verified Volunteers for their sponsorship this year to be able to provide this webinar for you today. And you see there that you have William's contact information. I'll make sure and include that with the follow-up information as well. And we'd just like to thank everybody for their time today. And especially you, William. I very, very much appreciate it.
Well, sure. And I just want to say I was at the National Summit on Volunteer Engagement in St. Paul last summer. Enjoyed meeting several members, you, Gretchen, and several other members of Alive. And I just want to say I just admire so much the work that you do and your dedication to it.
Thank you very much. Well, seeing no other questions, we will finish up. And I'd just like to thank everybody for being on the call and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.